Hi, I'm Mr. Wahlberg, and I'm glad you're here. Welcome back to my basement. It's good to see you again. I mean, I can't see you. It's a YouTube video, and it's not the way this works. But if I could say, I don't know, maybe you've been in my class. Maybe I have seen you. Not by the time I'm recording this. So it will be good to have seen you. Hopefully, I'll do that, and that would be great because, it's good to see you again. Welcome back to my basement. Hey, we're going to enter a new period in American history today. In period 6 in the APUSH calendar is that of empire building, and it discusses a wide variety of things from westward expansion to American imperialism, and all of it is super exciting. Turn with us now to those thrilling days of yesteryear, when out of the past come the thundering hoofbeats of Wahlberg's APUSH. History class rides again. We have 3 objectives today. By the end of this period, you should be able to discuss westward settlement and the era of the cowboy. You should be able to characterize the changing conditions of Native Americans at the end of the 19th century. And you should be able to describe the role of railroads in Western agriculture. But let's begin in Roman numeral number 1. And here I want to talk about how the West was really in an era of transition at the end of the 1800s, at the end of that 19th century. And let's begin with the discussion of farming in the Trans-Appalachian, or in the Trans-Mississippi West. Because here we're really moving in terms of like agriculture from the old East to what we think of now as sort of the Midwest and the central portion, the Great Plains, but the Trans-Mississippi West. More land came into cultivation during the 30 years after the Civil War than during the entirety of U.S. history for the last 250 years before it. But farming wasn't an easy row to hoe. It was difficult, and much of the work fell on to women. And they did it in blizzards and in droughts and with wild animals and loneliness and isolation, and all of that was really just common life out on the prairie. Farming, and crop production was successful. It turns out it's pretty good farmland there, and farm production increased. But as crop production increased, prices fell, and small farmers suffered severe difficulties during the last quarter of the 19th century. Now, when I say small farmers, I want to make sure we're all on the same page here. I'm talking about small, farmers on small-time farms. We're not talking about like diminutive farmers, but and I've said that before, but I want to make sure we're all up to speed on that. The future of farming lay not with small-time farmers, but with giant agricultural enterprises like those in California. But step point B, let's talk about the American cowboy. The Chisholm Trail was a trail connecting Abilene, Kansas, really to, the great cattle, or not cattle lots, but, the great cattle ranges of Texas. And the Chisholm Trail to Abilene, it brought the heyday of the cowboy, as 55,000 cowboys worked the plains from 1866 until 1885. And some were as young as 15. 15? That's like second semester freshmen. Some were as young as 15, and many were broken down by the time they were 40 years old. So by the time they were my age, they were, old, broken down old men. So it's kind of like being a high school history teacher. The iconic cowboy of the American myth, when you imagine, like, what does it mean to be a cowboy? You imagine riding the open range and herding cattle and fighting villains. And the real-life cowboy was not like that. It was a life of nonstop work. A cowboy worked 10 to 14 hours a day on a ranch and 14 hours a day on the trail, watching for any dangers that might upset the herds. Man, 10 to 14 hours a day, it is like being a high school history teacher. A cowboy might own his own saddle, but his horse usually belonged to the boss. And the cowboy was an expert rider and a roper. His gun was there to protect the herd from wild animals or diseased animals, rather than to, hunt or to chase outlaws. The season began with the spring roundup, when the ranch hands herded all the longhorn cattle they could find on the open range into a really large corral, kind of putting them all together in one corral. There they kept the herd penned for several days without feeding them, and just waiting them to get hungrier and hungrier, as because when the cattle eventually became so hungry that they preferred grazing to running away. Then the cowboys went through and sorted through the herds. They would claim the cattle marked with the brands of the ranch, or the calves to be branded. After the herd was gathered and branded, the trail boss then chose a crew, and they head out for the long drive. The long drive was an overland transport of the animals, and often landed, maybe it lasted as long as 3 months. Usually there was one cowboy for every 250 to 300 head of cattle, and a cook who also drove the chuck wagon and set up camp, and a wrangler who cared for the extra horses along the way. The trail boss earned $100 or more a month to go supervise the drive, and then also to go negotiate with the settlers and the Indians along the way. During this long drive, the cowboy was in the saddle from dawn to dusk. He slept on the ground and he bathed in rivers. The cowboys risked death and loss every day of the drive, especially at river crossings, which were particularly dangerous. There, the cattle were often hesitated. If they hesitated in the river, then they would be swept away. Lightning was also a real danger. And so cowboys, at night, they would pile their spurs and their buckles and any other metal pieces along the way at the edge of the camp, way off the edge of the camp. There where they go attract lightning and, attract it away from the camp. Thunder could cause a stampede and send off the herds, traveling anywhere. The Kansas Pacific Railroads, the Kansas Pacific Railroad was really the target of where the cattle drives would go to. They had stations in Abilene and Dodge City and Wichita, and they became destinations for thousands of, really millions of cattle from Texas along the way. Subpoint C, the great era of the cowboy ended almost as quickly as it began. And it ended mostly from overgrazing the land, but there was also this period of extended bad weather and the invention of barbed wire, which was a new technology, which was really nice for building fences, but it also meant that, it's hard to just drive cattle through as the West is getting all fenced off. Between 1883 and 1887, there were alternating patterns of dry summers and harsh winters, and that bad weather just ended up wiping out herds altogether. Most ranchers turned to smaller herds of really high-grade stock that would yield more meat per animal along the way. And ranchers were out fencing in the land, and with that barbed wire was cheap and easy to use, and it helped turn the open plains into series off of small fenced-in ranches from there. By the mid-1880s, farmers were enclosing more and more of the open range, and they moved cattle operations, basically to close to railroad connections. So there was no driving the cattle from Texas anymore. The cattle were being raised closer to where they could get onto the trains from there. By 1890, the romanticized American image of a wild and free cowboy had ended, and the era of the wide open West had come to its conclusion. The era of the cowboy occupies really a fairly narrow part in American history, just a handful of years after the Civil War. And it's funny, what we think of as the American image of the cowboy really only lasted 20 years, if that, altogether. Roman numeral number 2. Here I want to talk about how the effect of Native Americans in the time right after the Civil War. Before the Civil War, Westerners faced really, truthfully, very little contact with Native Americans. They were, they would do some trading and they kept pretty peaceful relations between both sides. But that changed with greater westward settlement. And there, the settlers came in greater and greater numbers. As settlers encroached on Indian lands, bloody conflict between the Army and the Plains tribes began in the 1850s and really continued through, about 1890, more or less. President Grant announced an 1869 peace policy in the West, but he was having a hard time preventing actual Indian wars. I might say this is among Grant's most impressive presidential actions, that, he prevented total Indian genocide. The fact that there's, any Native Americans that still exist is really a testament to the leadership that Grant showed at the time. Numbering about 30 million in the year 1800, buffalo were nearly extinct by 1890. Within the century, buffalo went from 30 million animals to almost extinct by the end of the century due to hunting and army campaigns by 1890. Subpoint B. In 1877, the Nez Perce Indians of Oregon and Idaho were ordered onto reservation land in Oklahoma, and they fled the order. They refused to go, and why would anybody want to move to Oklahoma? But they fled the order. And when they fled, they became fugitives who were chased nearly 1,700 miles before ultimately surrendering to American forces. Their Chief Joseph spoke of freedom before a distinguished audience in 1879, and he gave a call for liberty and equality under the law. Eventually, the Nez Perce Indians were moved into a reservation in the Washington Territory. Still a reservation, one closer to home. Does that make it any better? Subpoint C. 4 years after the Treaty of Fort Laramie, so a different Native American treaty, 4 years after the Treaty of Fort Laramie, miners found gold in the Black Hills of South Dakota, which was the land of the Sioux Indians, also the Cheyenne and the Arapaho Indians. And in 1874, Colonel George Custer reported that the Black Hills had gold from the grassroots down. It would be so easy to do any mining from there. When he reported that, he set off a gold rush to the Black Hills. The Sioux and the Cheyenne and the Arapaho, that's their native lands, they protested, but their protests fell on deaf ears. So in June of 1876, the Sioux and the Cheyenne held a sun dance, a particular religious festival known as a sun dance. And their Sitting Bull had this vision of so soldiers falling from their horses. When Custer's troops reached the Little Bighorn River, the natives were ready for him. They took Sitting Bull's vision as a sign that they should go prepare for the oncoming battle. And so when the Custer's troops reached the Little Bighorn River, the natives were ready for them. Led by Crazy Horse, Gall, and Sitting Bull, warriors outflanked and crushed any of Custer's troops that were there. Within an hour, Custer and a third of his 700 men were dead. Really, the only survivor of Custer's command was a horse, deliciously named Comanche. And the Comanche lived, for the next 15 years or so, was treated as a war hero, like a survivor of the battle. By late 1876, however, the Sioux were beaten. Sitting Bull and his fellow followers took refuge in Canada in 1881 when he avoided basically he surrendered to go avoid the starvation of his people. So, from 1876 till 1881, Sitting Bull, basically was a fugitive from the law. He surrendered, and as a negotiation to go let his people eat. Over time, people's opinions on Sitting Bull changed. He went from a hunted enemy to kind of a tourist attraction, I guess maybe the best way to say that. He appeared in Buffalo Bill Cody's Wild West show, and he would go make appearances and sign autographs and give speeches, and he actually ended up making kind of a small fortune for his appearances along the way, but he often gave away his money to homeless beggars, and the arc of Sitting Bull is a fascinating story. Subpoint D. Hey, we're going to talk about some other Native American victories because there's so precious few of them. They're really worth noting when they get there. In the Southwest, Apache leaders Cochise and Geronimo rebelled against them multiple times they had been relocated. So, leading a rebellion against a further relocation. Crossing and recrossing the Mexican border, they evaded the U.S. Army and eventually killed civilians until they surrendered in the mid-1800s. Indian resistance, though, it really only temporarily delayed the onward march of white soldiers and settlers and prospectors along the way. And this brings us to subpoint E, that of the Dawes Act. In 1871, Congress eliminated the treaty system that dated back to the Revolutionary Era, and switched from, like a treaty era, which would more or less guarantee the protection of the people there, to just straight out assimilation, trying to end the Indian way of life and just really act like proper white people. That's kind of the move of the Dawes Act. While a lot of Americans were supporters of Indian rights, the government policy remained supporting assimilation, where natives gave up their beliefs and way of life and then could become part of white culture. In 1887, the Dawes Act tried to Americanize Native Americans by breaking up the reservations and giving 160 acres to each head of household and 80 acres to each unmarried adult. The government planned to sell the rest of the land to settlers along the way and then use the proceeds from the sale of the land to go buy farm implements and give that to the Native Americans so they could, live a proper agricultural life. By 1932, white people had taken roughly 2/3 of Native American territory, but the Native Americans had received essentially no money from the sale of that land. So land stripped from them, sold for profit, and never received any of the profits from it. Subpoint F. Maybe the real destruction of the Native Americans was in the destruction of the buffalo, where tourists and fur traders in the West shot buffalo for sport, diminishing wild herds and destroying the Plains Indians' main source of food and clothing and shelter and fuel. In 1880, approximately 65 million buffalo roamed the plains. By 1890, so within the century, fewer than 1,000 remained. In 1900, the United States sheltered in Yellowstone National Park a single herd of wild buffalo. It was maybe the most significant blow to tribal life on the plains. Subpoint G. The Sioux Indians continued to suffer poverty and disease when an Indian prophet who promised that if the Sioux performed a particular ritual known as the ghost dance would be practiced, the Native American lands and way of life would be restored. The ghost dance movement spread rapidly among the 25,000 Sioux on the Dakota Reservation, which was alarming to the Army. Alarmed, military leaders ordered Sitting Bull arrested, and in December of 1890, about 40 police were sent in to go arrest him. Sitting Bull's friend and bodyguard Catch the Bear shot one of them. The police then killed Sitting Bull, and in the aftermath, Chief Bigfoot led the fearful Sioux away. Subpoint H. On December 28th of 1890, the 7th Cavalry, which had been Custer's old regiment, rounded up around 350 starving and freezing Sioux Indians and took them into a camp known at Wounded Knee Creek in South Dakota. The next day, soldiers demanded the Native Americans give up all of their weapons and go surrender all of their arms. When one of the Indians fired on a soldier, maybe, in fairness, the record is a little historically unclear and we'll never know. The soldiers then retaliated with cannon fire, shooting into what had now been an unarmed crowd. Within minutes, the army slaughtered 300 unarmed Native Americans, and soldiers just walked away, left the corpses to go freeze onto the ground. The Battle of Wounded Knee. This is maybe the final blow that brought the Indian Wars and truly an entire era of Native America to a bitter end. With that said, let's go to Roman numeral number 3. Here I want to talk about trains and the railroads of the West. The railroads brought in a national market because the railroad made possible the American Industrial Revolution. The venture was supported by private investment and generous land grants. By 1883, the railroads had established time zones for the country, and iron and coal and steel and lumber and glass industries grew up to meet the demand for materials and for parts. The growing population formed an ever-expanding market for mass production, mass distribution, and mass marketing of goods. And this is where we begin to see the emergence of real national brands. Because there's a possibility to go, move goods over a large area, like it becomes possible to have national brands, and that a brand is known over a large area. And we see these brands emerging like Quaker Oats and Ivory Soap and Sears Roebuck and Company, and things that couldn't have existed in a different generation can now because of the transportation brought along by the railroads. The railroads were big, complex companies. They pioneered the modern techniques of business organization. They were the biggest industries in the whole nation. And as tracks expanded across geographic areas, the sheer size of operations, the surveying and the engineering and the scheduling and the accounting, it required organization on a massive scale that had never been seen kind of in human history. The systems also to support the new industry shaped the infrastructure from which the modern business enterprise would emerge. Things like management and finance and business analysis and distribution, all these things formed together as a result of the railroads. While railroads created national markets for cattle and crops, they also charged very high rates for shipping farm products. And railroads argue that shipping goods from the sparsely populated quarters of the West, it was expensive, but farmers said, yeah, we understand it's expensive, but we're paying unfair and uneven rates. The farmers responded to railroad policies by forming a cooperative where farmers said, if we're going to go do business with the railroads, then we'll do business together. And this new cooperative became known as the Grange. It was a cooperative organization for storing and marketing grain, and we'll talk more about this soon. Subpoint C. Congress tried to approach the question of railroads through a different organization known as the Interstate Commerce Commission, which formed in 1887 to go try and bring fairness to the rates that railroads were out charging farmers. It was the first agency to try to regulate economic activity, the ICC, but it really lacked the power to set rates. The ICC could only sue companies in court, and it was kind of ineffective at doing so. Passed in 1890, the Sherman Antitrust Act went and banned practices that were restraining free trade, but it was also used to go prohibit unions as well. And all of this stuff sets up kind of a bigger fight that we'll get into over the next few weeks. The act was also hard to enforce and helped to establish the national government. The idea that the national government could regulate the economy to promote the public good. These two pieces, the Interstate Commerce Commission and the Sherman Antitrust Act, are really pretty fascinating developments because they show the national government getting involved in business practices, which heretofore had really not been a role of the national government. So it's a tremendously fascinating development in terms of political history, and that development is going to set off what is really the rest of this unit and how businesses are going to operate, how farmers are going to go deal with businesses, and railroads and what the government's role is, and it's a fascinating story that I can't wait to tell you about. Make sure you like and subscribe. God bless you.